down to the second to last week of this series on what you need to know before joining our church. And I'm talking about now the requirements for church membership. And I'm down to the second point on that. That's on page 20 if you have it. And that is financial support of the church and the pastor. Church members are supposed to give of the first fruits, we're told, of all of our increase unto the Lord in Proverbs 3, 9 through 10. I like this verse because it not only gives us a duty, but then it also gives us a reward that is attached to the duty. And all of you who have done it know that it's true. In Proverbs 3, 9 through 10, it says, "Honor the Lord with thy substance, and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine." So the Lord promises that if we give to Him of our first fruits, give to Him off the top, then He fills our barns with plenty and our presses with new wine, which is old-fashioned terminology to say that, hey, you take care of Him and He'll take care of you financially, however that works out in this day and age. And part of the giving to the Lord is financially supporting the pastor whom God has given to the church. I'll just give you a couple of verses for this. I know I just talked about this briefly the other day in the Bible study, and normally I don't talk about this all that often, so I don't want you to think I'm hinting at anything, because I'm not hinting at anything. I'm just covering the requirements, and it just so happened that the two of these things came close together in time, these two studies. Hebrews 13, verses 16 and 17. It says, "But to do good and to communicate, forget not, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. Obey them that have the rule over you, and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls as they that must give account, that they may do it with joy, not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you." Now, if you're reading this and you are reading it with your 21st century vocabulary, then you think, well, what does this have to do with giving money or giving support to the pastor or anything? But if you define the term communicate as it was used back in the old days, in 1611, it means, and this is the number one definition, primary definition, to give to another as a partaker, to give a share of, to impart, confer, or transmit. So we use it today to refer to giving verbal exchange, right? You're giving a part of yourself to somebody else whenever you communicate with them, and you let them know what's going on in your mind, and then they in turn let you know what's going on in their mind, and you have given something to each other. But primarily it refers to not just to speech, but to giving just in general, to give a part of anything to somebody else. So when he says to do good and to communicate, forget not, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased, this is a communication where you're giving a part or a share of what you have to the Lord. And if you look in Galatians 6 and verse 6, then this verse, I just thought it was curious, and maybe there's not much of a connection there, but in Hebrews it talks about communicating, and then it goes on to talk about the pastor who has the oversight. But then if you look in Galatians 6 and verse 6, there's definitely a link made between these two things. Galatians 6 and verse 6. If I can find it, that's before Ephesians. There we go. Galatians 6 and verse 6. It says, "Let him that is taught in the word communicate unto him that teacheth in all good things." So you guys are the ones that are taught. I'm the one that teaches, and that's why you communicate to me in all good things. And all good things, like when John says, just something came to mind when he says that if you have this world's good and you give not to your brother that's in need. It just reminded me the good things and have this world's good. I just want to look that up here. John 3:17. "Whoso hath this world's good, and seeth his brother have need, and shutteth up his bowels of compassion, from him how dwelleth the love of God in him." So I think that's a good comparison there when you communicate all good things, and he that hath this world's good. If you've been blessed with material prosperity, then you communicate that onto the one that teaches you. And the reason for this is pretty easy to figure out, because I feed you spiritually and then you feed me physically, quite literally. I mean, you actually do feed me through, well, Ben actually feeds me with food that he gives me sometimes, but the rest of you feed me through your financial contribution to me. So you feed me, you clothe me, you house me, you take care of my needs, and I take care of your spiritual needs, teaching you Bible doctrine. So I don't look at it just as a financial transaction, but there is a give and take, right? I give to you spiritually, you give to me physically. That's kind of how it works. 1 Corinthians 9, 6 through 11. 1 Corinthians 9, 6 through 11. And like I said in that Bible study the other night, I'm not telling you need to do something above what you're already doing. You guys are doing great. You're doing what you should do, and I'm not complaining one bit. I'm just going through the requirements for church membership. So please don't think that I'm trying to beat you up or something, because I am not. 1 Corinthians 9, 6 through 11. Paul says, or I only and Barnabas, have not we power to forbear working? Who goeth a warfare any time in his own charges? Who planteth a vineyard and eateth not of the fruit thereof? Or who feedeth a flock and eateth not of the milk of the flock? Say I these things as a man, or saith not the law the same also? He's saying, so a soldier wouldn't go to war on his own dime, right? And a farmer wouldn't feed his flock and not expect to take some of the milk of the flock, right? It's a principle that is throughout life. Verse 9, for it is written in the law of Moses, thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doth God take care for oxen? Oh, God's concerned about oxen, but he's concerned more about his ministers, which are likened unto oxen. Paul goes on to say, or saith he it altogether for our sakes, that is, Paul and Barnabas and ministers of the gospel. For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he that ploweth should plow in hope, and he that thresheth in hope should be partaker of his hope. So when the farmer goes out there and plows the field and sows the seed, then he has hope that it's going to reap fruit, right? Reap benefit to him. And this is what Paul's saying that the ministry does as well. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? So that goes back to what I originally said. I feed you spiritually, you feed me physically. Now, normally the pastor should be able to live off of the monetary contributions of the church. Of a church of sufficient size, that would be how it typically works. 1 Corinthians 9, 13 through 14, just down a couple of verses. He says, know ye not that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar. He's referring to the Old Testament Levitical priesthood. When those men waited at the altar and sacrifices were brought, they were given a portion of that sacrifice to feed themselves. And then Paul likens that system to this system. Even so, verse 14, even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. Because, and if you think about it, you only have so much time in a day, right? So if a church expected the pastor to work full time and then also to try to do the work of the ministry, that would get pretty difficult. So the Lord has set it up so that the pastor can devote his time to studying the Word and to prayer and to counseling people, to helping people, to preaching the Word and so on. And then in exchange for that time that he sets aside for that, then the church provides for the needs that he would normally be providing for on his own. That's how the Lord set it up. Now, when a church is few in number, as is this church, then it may not be possible. And when such is the case, then the pastor has to work a second job. And Paul himself did this, as I know I just mentioned this here a couple of weeks ago in that Bible study. In Acts 18 and verse 3, Paul had a secular occupation that he did before, I don't know if it was before he became a Pharisee or while he was a Pharisee. I'm not sure if being a Pharisee was a full-time job, or I don't know about that, to be honest with you. But anyway, he had a secular occupation, and he used this secular occupation from time to time to provide for his needs whenever he either needed to or whenever he did so to teach the brethren by example. And I talked about that in the bus driving Bible study, which is kind of a strange title for a Bible study. But anyway, bus driving by the Bible, you can go check that out if you didn't hear it already. In Acts 18 and verse 3, it says here, And because he was of the same craft, he had stopped by and was hanging out with Aquila and Priscilla. And it says, and because he was of the same craft, he abode with them and wrought, which means worked, for by their occupation they were tent makers. So he worked with them. They did the same type of thing, and they made a little extra money so that Paul could take care of his needs. And Paul was an industrious guy, and he actually even took care of people that were with him by working as well. In verse 34 of Acts 20:34, he tells the elders at Ephesus, and this is, I never even thought about this. I don't think I mentioned this in the Bible study. He's giving instruction to elders, right, to pastors. And he says, yea, ye yourselves know that these hands have ministered unto my necessities and to them that were with me. Telling them, hey, here's an example to you guys, too. You may have to work a part-time secular occupation to provide for your needs as well at some point in your ministry. Now, church members are also required to support the financial needs of the church. Financial needs of the church would include things like financially supporting widows that meet the biblical qualification for support of the church. Those qualifications are given in 1 Timothy 5, 3 through 16. 1 Timothy 5, 3 through 16. I guess I probably haven't preached on this. I don't know. I'm sure I've covered it somewhere along the way, but I'll just read this passage here and just comment a little bit, and so we'll all know what qualifies for widows' support of the church. 1 Timothy 5, 3 through 16. It says, honor widows, which are widows indeed. But if any widow have children or nephews, let them learn first to show piety at home and to requite their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. So the church is to honor widows, and when he's referring to honoring widows, he's talking about taking care of widows, as he will go on to say. But he says, if they have children, let the children take care of their mother, right? That it wouldn't make sense for the church to take care of a widow whenever she has children. That's part of the reason why you have kids, so they can take care of you when you get old, right? Verse 5. Now she that is a widow indeed and desolate trusteth in God and continueth in supplications and prayers night and day. So there's a couple qualifications right there. In order for her to be a widow indeed, and indeed means to be a widow that the church would be supporting, she has to be desolate, for one thing. So if she has income coming in, if she's taken care of, then she's not desolate and she doesn't need church support. Secondly, she has to trust in God. And she has to continue in supplications and prayers night and day. So this has to be a godly widow, not a widow that's out there running around and being a busybody, as Paul talks about here in a minute, but somebody who is a godly, desolate widow. Verse 6, but she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth. And these things give in charge, that they may be blameless. For if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith, and is worse than an infidel. Let not a widow be taken into the number under 60 years old, having been the wife of one man. So here's more qualifications now. She's got to be 60, which is 60. And she has to have been the wife of one man. So she had to be a widow, had been married to one man in her life. So those are two more. Here's some more. Well reported of for good works. If she have brought up children, if she have lodged strangers, if she have washed the saints' feet, if she have relieved the afflicted, if she have diligently followed every good work. So you see here, there's some pretty high qualifications for a widow to receive support of the church. And I guess these things are not things that the average woman is probably thinking about for the future, but these are things that we all should be doing. But if you are a woman and you think, well, maybe someday I will be a widow, and maybe someday I will need to be taken care of, well, here's some things that you might want to be doing ahead of time so that the church would be able to take care of you in your old age. But, verse 11, but the younger widows refuse, for when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry, having damnation, because they have cast off their first faith. And withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but tattlers, also in busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some are already turned aside after Satan. So this is the reason why the widow has to be an older widow to receive church support, because in these days it was more likely that people died early sometimes, not always. They've always been living into their 70s and 80s, according to Solomon, but young death was more prevalent in those days. I mean, you got a bad infection or something, you just died, right? There's no antibiotics and things like that, and so it was not an unlikely thing that a woman could be a young widow in those days. But the worst thing in the world you could do is to take a 25-year-old widow and put her on church support for the rest of her life, and then all she has to do is run around and be a busybody and a tattler and chatting it up with all of the ladies in town and gossiping and causing trouble. And I mean, you wouldn't want to do that. So that's why she's got to be old and she's got to be desolate and so on. But for the young widows, get married again. Get married, and then you got a husband and children to take care of, a house to take care of, and you're not going to be out there stirring up trouble, gossiping. That's what Paul says. Verse 16, if any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed. So this is a legitimate church financial function. The church should financially support widows who are widows indeed and meet all those qualifications, and that's a lot of qualifications. But if there is such a woman in the church, then that would merit the church collectively putting money together to help out that widow and to take care of her in her need. But if she's got husband or if she's got children, then the children ought to be taken care of her, not the church. So another thing that would be a financial, another thing that the church should give to financially is the cost of the meeting place, whether it would be owned or rented. So in our case, we all contribute nothing every month to pay for this free room, right? So we all share the cost of nothing in this case, which is a really nice deal we have going here. So we don't, and I'll get to this in just a second, but we don't take a regular collection for the church finances in this church. As a matter of fact, we've never taken a collection for church finances in this church. As a matter of fact, in the whole 5.5 years that I've been in the ministry, in both churches that I've served, I have never taken even one collection for the church, per se. The Minneapolis church had some money whenever I got there, and then the meeting room was cheap there, and as part of my Lord's money, because I do the same thing I tell you to do, put money aside for the Lord, is my Lord's money, I used part of that to pay for the church room. And so I never actually took an offering ever one time, and the whole time I've been in the ministry, for the church. Not to say that I never will, but we certainly don't need it in this church. We don't have any expenses. And we do have some money that was left over from the dissolution of the Minneapolis church anyway, if we ever did need anything. But someday that might change. Someday we might outgrow this room or something, and we might need to rent a place, and then we could take up an offering to pay for the expenses of that room. Third thing that the church, that we should be giving to the church for the church to help out with, or that we could be giving to the church for the church to help out with, is helping out the poor brethren in the church. In Galatians 2 and verse 10. When the Apostle Paul, when it was determined that he would go to the Gentiles and that Peter and James and John would go to the Jews, when they were parting ways and wishing each other well, one of the things that Peter wanted to make sure that Paul was up to speed on was giving to the poor, was taking care of the poor. And it says there in Galatians 2 and verse 10, it says, only they would that we should remember the poor, the same which I also was forward to do. This is something that we should personally do, but then this is also something that the church should do for the poor within its number. Once again, poor meeting qualifications, not just anybody that asks for it, but somebody that is truly in need. Romans 12 and verse 13, this is instruction to a church, and Paul tells them in Romans 12 and verse 13, distributing to the necessity of saints, given to hospitality. So we're supposed to be distributing to the necessity, right? So that's the need, when somebody's truly in need. And the Bible has, very limited criteria for that, to be truly in need. To be wanting food or clothing or shelter, or maybe basic medical care like the Good Samaritan helped out the Levi that had been beat up. But those basic things are considered need, not all the other things that we think we need. We think we need a lot of stuff that we don't actually need. But if we have a brother or a sister that is in need in the church, a saint in the church, then we ought to be distributing to that. So that would be another thing that we would contribute to the church finances for. So like I said, our church does not take up a regular collection for the church needs at this time. That could change someday. So therefore, at this time, church members should be setting aside some of their Lord's money and saving it for a time when it is needed. And that's what I've told all of you to do since I've been your pastor. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 2. I would much rather you guys set aside part of your Lord's money and have it laid by and stored by yourselves. And then that way, when a need comes up, it's not some big pot, in the church fund that we all can decide what to do with. It's more like, hey, we have a need. Anybody that has money laid aside that they have put aside for this purpose, donate if you would like to and take care of the need. That's the way that I like doing things. It's a lot better that way. And it causes a lot less strife that way whenever the money is not collectively owned by the church, where everybody has it laid by in store, and we can take care of needs as they come up. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 2. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. This collection of the saints that he's referring to is a collection for the poor saints in Jerusalem. There had been a drought, a dearth in the land, and they were hit very hard by it. And Paul had been telling numerous of the Gentile churches that he had started that they were supposed to take up an offering, and then he would come by and he would collect that and he would take it down to Jerusalem to help out another church. So this is another one which I didn't really give. I did say poor brethren in the church. I was really more referring to within our own church, but we could also and should also be ready to help out brethren in other churches if they fall on hard times, and this is our example here to do that. He says in verse 2, upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. So when Paul was telling them, hey, I want you to set aside for a need here for this other church, what I want you to do is every week, whenever you get paid or you bring in increase, then you set aside some of that, and then when I get there, you don't have to be scrambling to try to find money. You've already got it laid aside. It's already in an account. It's ready to go. This is what I like to do. This is what I like to do with personal finances as well. I got a whole bunch of little bank accounts for various things that would come up not every month, but every 6 months or every year, like insurance and taxes and things like that. Lay by yourself in store. That's what I recommend. Take a little bit out of each paycheck, figure out how much you need to take out of each paycheck, put it in that account every paycheck, and then whenever a car comes up and you got to buy it, you already got the money. Whenever your car insurance comes up every 6 months or every year, you save money, When you pay your insurance every year or every 6 months, it's way cheaper than paying it every month. So that's what I do. Put the money in the account, and then you got it to pay out. Or for your vacation fund, when you want to take a trip, put a little money in there every month, and then whenever it's time to take a trip, not scraping along to try to find it, you already have it. So anyway, a good biblical principle for church and for life in general. You can see sermons on giving to God, where I talked about this more at ExcelsiorSpringsChurch.com/giving to God with dashes between the words. Okay, so the next requirement for church membership is to maintain contact with the pastor and church members. This is especially important for non-resident members, which we don't have any right now. This is the first time that probably actually the first church I've ever been a member of, not just since I've been in the ministry, where there have been no non-resident members at this moment anyway. But this point should go without saying. I mean, the fact that I need to tell church members, non-resident or residents, that you should be keeping in contact with the pastor and with each other, it would be almost superfluous to mention, but as you all know, we've had issues where, for some reason, church members just don't want to talk to anybody and just kind of go off in la-la land somewhere. So anyway, non-resident members should be checking in with the pastor by phone or email at least once per month. This is just I don't have a Bible verse for this, but this is just my gray area judgment call, and it's more of just a suggestion, really. It's not a hard, fast rule, but I would like you to contact me at least once a month if you're a non-resident member, which none of you are, but if that's the case, that's the deal. And I believe that the onus should be on the non-resident member to contact the pastor. For one thing, back in Minneapolis, I had a lot of non-resident members. There was a lot of you and only one of me. So if I have to contact each one of you all the time, that's a lot of contacting on my part. Whereas if you contact me, that's much easier. And secondly, if you're a non-resident member, I think the onus is on you to contact the pastor and church members, because if you're a resident member, you're here every Sunday, and I see you and you see each other. But if you're a non-resident member, and hey, just that's the way it works out. Sometimes you find the gospel and you're a long ways away, but still, it's on you to make the contact with the pastor. It's like Elder Conrad Jarrell said one time, if you contact me, you're checking in. If I contact you, I'm babysitting. So and I thought that was good. And non-resident members should also keep in contact with other church members as well. We read something similar to that in Malachi, or at least a principle for that in Malachi 3 and verse 16. Malachi 3:16. It says, "And they that feared the Lord spake often one to another, and the Lord hearkened and heard it, and a book of remembrance was written before him for them that feared the Lord, and that thought upon his name." So these people that fear God, they spake often one to another. So this would go for resident members, non-resident members, everybody. We should be in contact with each other, and it's easy for resident members because we see each other once or twice a week, at least. Now, that's not to say that the onus is 100% on non-resident members. As resident members, we should likewise be keeping up with non-resident members. And I liked to do that whenever I was a member in Cincinnati and we had non-resident members. I kept up with the non-resident members. I would call them, and I was pretty close with our non-resident members, one of which I never did get to meet. Poor guy was down in Florida, and he was old and big and couldn't really get out of his house, and I had a nice friendship with him, even though I've never met the guy in the flesh, and he's now in heaven, and someday I'll get a chance to, Lord willing. But anyway, we should be reaching out to them too, because as you all know, it is lonely being a non-resident member, is it not? So we should, of course, be reaching out to them whenever we have some, again, Lord willing. Okay, the next requirement for church membership is to be of one mind and to be unified in the faith. This point really distinguishes our church from a lot of churches out there, because there's a lot of churches out there in churchianity that there's no unification in the church whatsoever. Everybody just kind of believes whatever they feel like. And that was the way it was in the church that I grew up in. It was just, there was no unity. In fact, I've probably told this story before, but one of the things that my dad likes so much about his church is that, there's just people here that believe just about everything. And I'm like, I'm not sure that's a positive, but yeah, we've got Calvinists, we've got Arminians, we've got premillennials, we've got amillennials, it sounds like a mess to me and confusion. But anyway, church members should be unified in the faith, according to the Bible anyway. Romans 15, 5 through 6. Romans 15, 5 through 6. So in that church, in a church like that, you really wouldn't have probably much deep communication between the members, because if you did, it would just end up in strife, right? Because then everybody would be debating back and forth, and that's not what the church is supposed to be. Romans 15, 5 through 6. It says, "Now the God of patience and consolation grant you to be like-minded one toward another, according to Christ Jesus, that ye may with one mind and one mouth glorify God, even the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ." Pretty hard to do that when you believe different things about Jesus Christ, right? Well, I believe he saved us by himself. Well, I believe that I had to help him out. You're not going to one mind and one mouth glorify God and the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. I believe he's eternally begotten. No, I don't. I believe he's incarnate. He's begotten in his human nature, right? Well, how are you going to glorify God and the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ whenever you got different ideas about who God is and who Jesus is? Look at Philippians 1 and verse 27. Philippians 1 and verse 27. Let your conversation be as it becometh the gospel of Christ, that whether I come and see you or else be absent, I may hear of your affairs, that ye stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. You see there? One mind, one spirit, striving together for the faith. The one faith, right? There is only one true faith out there. And we should be holding to it the closest that we can and trying to ever reform ourselves whenever we find that we have veered from that one faith. Philippians 2 and verse 2. He says, fulfill ye my joy that ye be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. This is what the church should be. One accord, one mind. This is doctrinally I'm speaking of here. Church members should be speaking the same thing doctrinally. I'm not saying we have to be of one mind about what sports teams we like or don't like. We don't have to be one mind about that. What type of cars we like, right? What type of food we like to eat. Anything like that, none of that stuff matters, right? We can have diverse opinions about all that stuff. But when it comes to Bible doctrine, we should be of one mind and one accord. 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 10. 1 Corinthians 1, 10. Now I beseech you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that ye all speak the same thing, and that there be no divisions among you, but that ye be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. You're not going to find that in very many churches, that people are perfectly joined together. If you go to our church and you ask a question, how does a sinner get saved? You're going to hear the same answer. Different verses, maybe different explanation, but you're going to hear the same answer. What's going to happen on the last day? You're going to hear the same answer, right? Any number of things, you're going to hear the same answer. But when you go to a lot of churches out there, you're going to get as many answers as you ask people, right? I mean, they got different and diverse ideas about all kinds of stuff. The pastor never really teaches much of anything. They hear the same old sermon about, John 3:16 or something every Sunday. And probably the reason why there's so much, diversity in the church is because nobody even really knows what they believe or what they're supposed to believe because they've never been taught. But Lord willing, that won't be the case in this church. The church is not the court of the Areopagites where everybody shares his diverse and strange doctrines. Look at Acts 17 and verse 21. Now, that's not to say that everybody just has to be robots and just repeat whatever the pastor said and never think for yourself or anything like that. And if you are reading the Bible on your own, which you should be, and you see something, you're like, I wonder about that. That's maybe we're missing something here. I'll tell you how you deal with that, right? Come talk to the pastor about it, right? You should be studying on your own. And that's not to say, I don't want a bunch of parrots in this church that are just going to repeat everything they've heard and never think for themselves. Not at all. Acts 17 and verse 21. But here's what we don't want. We don't want to be like the Athenians. It says, for all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. That's why some of them were interested to talk to Paul about the gospel, because it was just something new. It was different, and they could go to their buddies and say, hey, did you hear about this guy supposedly named Jesus? He's supposed to have risen from the dead. And then they can just, no, I didn't hear about that. And then, so this guy, now he's got something he can tell everybody else. But they weren't really interested in the truth, a lot of them. Some of them were, some of them weren't. But we don't want to be this way. We don't want to be people that are just jumping from one new thing to the other just to be able to talk about something new, right? Hebrews 13 and verse 9. We're not supposed to be carried about with strange doctrines. Hebrews 13 and verse 9 It says, "Be not carried about with diverse and strange doctrines, for it is a good thing that the heart be established with grace, not with meats, which have not profited them that have been occupied therein." So it sounds like there must have been, and it makes sense, that Paul's writing to Hebrews, to Jews who were under the Old Testament law, and he says, don't be carried about with strange doctrines, and he starts talking about different foods, right? Because there were doctrines apparently going on in this church about what should be eaten and what should not be eaten, and we already talked about that the other day, I think it was last Sunday, that there is no Christian diet. Strange meaning foreign, right? Not so much weird, but something that is foreign. So we're not supposed to be carried about with all these other doctrines out there. Number 5 requirement for church membership is supporting other members. As church members, we should be bearing one another's burdens. Galatians 6 and verse 2. This could refer to financially helping each other out, but it more generally refers to just being there and helping each other out, being there to carry someone's burden with them, whether it's helping them physically or helping them emotionally or spiritually or whatever the thing might be. Galatians 6 and verse 2. It says, "Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." It's pretty tough to be an island out there, to be all by yourself and to not have anybody to help you out. And it's so nice, and you all know this, how this feels whenever you have somebody out there to help you out when you need a hand, or to be there to help somebody else out when they need a hand. And what goes around comes around. And when you have a church like that, when people are there for each other, like this church is, it's wonderful. It's so nice to have people that are there for you and yourself to be made available to help out others. That's the way it should be. We should be rejoicing with them that rejoice and weeping with them that weep. Somebody gets a promotion at work, we rejoice with them. When somebody's parent dies, we weep with them, right? When somebody gets sick, we feel bad for them. Romans 12 and verse 15. Romans 12 and verse 15. "Rejoice with them that do rejoice, and weep with them that weep." Sometimes you just need a shoulder to cry on, and sometimes you just need somebody to tell and bask in your joy with you when something wonderful has happened to you, and we should be there for brethren for both of those things. Number 6, being subject and accountable to the pastor and other church members. This is another requirement of church membership. Church members should submit to one another. Ephesians 5 and verse 21. This is why a lot of people don't want to join the church, right? They'd rather remain on the outside and listen to sermons on the internet because they don't want to be accountable to a church or to a pastor. It's easier just to be out there by yourself, do whatever you want, never have to answer to anybody for anything. Ephesians 5 and verse 21. It says, "Submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God." So every one of us has to submit to every other one of us. And that even means me as the pastor, that I submit to you guys and you submit to me. I submit to you because all you have to say is, "Pastor, the Bible says this." And guess what? End of discussion. If that's what the Bible says and I'm wrong, I submit to you. And it works the same way with me to you. I just happen to be telling you what the Bible says more often than you end up telling me. But if you tell me, hey, I submit to that just like you do. Look at 1 Peter 5 and verse 5. 1 Peter 5 and verse 5. It says, "Likewise ye younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility, for God resisteth the proud, and giveth grace to the humble." It doesn't matter if you have whoever the youngest member, who is the youngest member of the church? I guess Set's the youngest member of the church, and Bev's the oldest member. Okay, so it doesn't matter if Set's young and Bev's older. I won't say you're old, but older, right? Bev is older, more experienced, more mature. We'll put it that way, right? And if Set comes up to Bev and says, hey, Sister Bev, I think I want to talk to you about something. I don't like what you did there. Maybe you shouldn't do that or say that or something like that. Then Bev should submit to Set, even though Set's the youngest one. And of course, it would go the other way without speaking. If Bev says something to Set, then Set, of course, should submit to that. That's, of course, if the person's right when they're approaching you about something. Maybe they're not right, but at least hear them out, right? No matter who it is, no matter how young they are, no matter how old they are, hear them out. Because if somebody has the guts to come up to you and talk to you about something, at least hear them out, because it takes a lot of guts to talk to somebody about something when you think that they're wrong or that maybe they should be changing something in their life. A church is also accountable to the pastor, who gives an account to them of before God in Hebrews 13, 7 through 17. Hebrews 13, 7 through 17. Remember them which have the rule over you, who have spoken unto you the word of God, whose faith follow, considering the end of their conversation. And then verse 17, obey them that have the rule over you, and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls, as they that must give account, that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you. So the church members are supposed to submit to the pastor because, for one reason, is because I am the overseer, right? I am the one that watches for your souls, and I'm the one that goes to God with an account of you to God. And if you don't submit to what is taught in this church, and then I go to God and I say, Lord, this guy or this woman is killing me here, and they're not doing anything that I'm teaching from the Scripture, then that's not going to go well for you. That's what it says there. It's unprofitable for you. Because maybe I can't do anything to you, but God can do something to you. So not a good idea to not submit to the pastor when he's right. If I'm wrong, tell me about it. But if I'm right, then you should submit to that, whatever it is. You can see the sermon that I did in this church before it was a church a long time ago, but a little over 3 years ago, called What It Means to Be a Church. And it's at the church website at that URL, What It Means to Be a Church, with dashes between the words. I covered all these things back there. That was the sermon that I did preparing you to become a church, telling you what to expect if you were to become a church. Okay, the next thing is pastoral authority, and this kind of just builds on what I was just referring to, and I will cover this just in brief. I've done a couple of sermons on this topic alone, which I will refer you to here in a minute. So the pastor, which is the same as the elder, the bishop, the overseer, and the steward, those are all names for the same office. He has the rule over the church. I've already read Hebrews 13, 7 and 17. I will take you to 1 Timothy 5 and verse 17. I know that none of you have a problem with this, or if you do, you're good at hiding it because you don't appear like you do anyway. But there are people out there that don't like any kind of authority at all, and just the idea of pastoral authority really grates on them, especially given what most churches are like, where the pastor's just a motivational speaker and he's just up there smiling and shaking hands with people and kissing babies or whatever. He really he's just a paper tiger. Has no authority at all. And that's what most people are used to. So if you come to a church where the actual pastoral authority is practiced, they don't like that idea. They don't like anybody telling them anything. And you know what? I don't want that kind in this church anyway, so go to the happy, clappy community church down the road and, have at it. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 17 says, let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially they who labor in the word and doctrine. So that's just a verse to show you that the elders have the rule over the church, and the elders are also the ones that labor in the word and doctrine, which is what Paul said there in Hebrews 13:7. Remember them that have the rule over you, who have spoken unto you the word of God. The pastor is given authority by God to reprove, rebuke, warn, admonish, and exhort church members of their duties to God and his law. Let me just give you a couple of verses on this just to show you what my job is. Titus 2 and verse 15. These things speak and exhort and rebuke with all authority. let no man despise thee. This is Paul's instruction to a young minister. So speak, exhort, and rebuke with all authority. That's the pastor's job. You think, oh, I wish I got to be the one that got to yell at everybody. Well, until you actually try being in that position, then you realize it's not such a fun job after all. It'd be one thing if you never have to deal with anybody. If you just kind of show up to church, you just come and yell at people, and then you retreat back somewhere else and you never see them till the next Sunday, and you're not close with them or anything, then I guess it'd be pretty easy. Just get up there and yell at people and then leave. But when you actually are one body and you're like a family, then it's a lot harder to do that kind of thing, Look at 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 12. 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 12. And we beseech you, brethren, to know them which labor among you, and are over you in the Lord, and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake, and be at peace among yourselves. So they that labor among you, and that are over you, so your overseer, is the one that admonishes you. To admonish you is to put you in mind of duty, of things that you ought to be doing. That's part of the pastor's job. I'll give you one more, 2 Timothy 4 and verse 12. Second Timothy 4:12. I don't think that's. I think I wanted 1 Timothy 4:12 because. Oh, 2 Timothy 4:2. There we go. I was going to say Tychicus being sent to Ephesus probably didn't really have much to do with what I'm talking about. Verse 2. Thank you. 2 Timothy 4:2, which I don't even know why I know that verse. That's what happens when you look at the outline, then you just don't even think anymore. Anyway. Preach the word, be instant, in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine. So that's the job of a preacher, is to preach it in season, when it's fashionable to be heard, out of season, when it's not fashionable, when they don't want to hear it, reprove, rebuke, and exhort. So exhorting is put you in mind of what you should do. Reproving is telling you when you've been wrong and telling you what you should do. And rebuke is a stronger version of reproof. So rebuke is really getting on you and telling you, what, that was wrong, and you don't want to ever do that again. The pastor should be obeyed when he is exercising the authority that God has given him. Okay, so it's not like I just get to make up rules and just tell you to do whatever I feel like just for the fun of it. You obey me whenever I'm giving you a verse and saying, this is what God says you're supposed to do, okay? So in a sense, you're really not obeying me, you're just obeying God, right? I'm just telling you what God said. Obey them that have the rule over you and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls, right? I've already read that verse to you, but the person that has the rule is to be obeyed whenever he's exercising his God-given authority, not whenever he's just being some kind of a tyrant and just telling you to do things just because he can or something. The pastor is not to be a lord over the church, but he's to be a feeder of the flock, a leader and an example to them. I'll give you a couple of verses. 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 8. I know that any member of this church would vouch for me that I'm not some kind of a tyrant, right? And everybody knows that. And whenever I preach on pastoral authority, somebody that didn't know me might be like, ooh, boy, this kind of sounds like this guy's, on a power trip or something. I'm just telling you what the Bible says, but you know that that's not how I act. I am not on any kind of a power trip. 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 8 says, for though I should boast somewhat more of our authority, which the Lord hath given us for edification and not for your destruction, I should not be ashamed. See, Paul says his authority that God gave him was for edification, not for destruction, right? The authority that God has given, and this is true of all authorities that God has given, it is for edification. Even governmental civil authority is supposed to be done for edification, right? To help improve society. It's like Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, in Romans 13, about the powers that be, that they are to be there. Let me just read that to you. They are to be there for the promotion of good and the punishment of evil. Romans chapter 13. This is the case of all God-given authority. He says in verse 2, he says that you're not supposed to resist the power. Verse 3, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. See, they're there for edification. They're there to make the society better. They're supposed to be anyway. For he is the minister of God to thee for good, you see. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. This is what God has given civil government for. Unfortunately, the government we have today punishes very little evil and punishes a whole lot of good. Right? They don't really even hardly fit into that criteria there in Romans 13 at all. But to the extent that they do, they ought to be obeyed. When they're doing right and doing good and punishing evil and promoting good, then they of course should be obeyed. When they're doing the opposite of that, they shouldn't be obeyed. Right? And you can do whatever your conscience allows you in that case, but that's not, they are not doing what God has given them to do. Just like if the pastor starts making up a bunch of rules or something and just being a little petty tyrant, you don't have to submit to that. You don't have to obey that. And it's the same way with civil government as well. Look at 1 Peter 5, 1 through 3. Because remember, we ought to obey God rather than man. And that's where the line is in the sand. And when you get up closer to that line, then it's a bit of a gray area, but that's where the line is in the sand. Whenever anybody, no matter who they are, requires something of you that God forbids, or forbids something of you that God requires, either one, you do not have to and should not obey. 1 Peter 5, 1 through 3. It says, the elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed, feed the flock of God. This is what an elder does. He's a pastor. He's a feeder of the sheep. Feed the flock of God, which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being ensamples to the flock. So a pastor is a feeder. He's an overseer, according to this verse, and he is an example. Not to be a lord over God's heritage, but to be an example to you. That's what the pastor's there for. You can see sermons on pastoral authority at ExcelsiorSpringsChurch.com/1-pastor. There's that pastoral authority series there. There's also the One Pastor in Church Government series that I preached a while back as well. All right, one more section here, and then we will call it quits for the day, or the preaching part anyway. And that is dealing with problems in the church. Now, I'm going to first talk about interpersonal problems today, and then next Sunday, I will finish up by talking about doctrinal disagreements and problems with the pastor and how you deal with those things. But we're just going to do the interpersonal one today. So if you're offended by another church member, you have a couple of options. You can either forget about it, or you can address it with that church member and deal with it biblically. And either one of those things is okay. You can forget about it or deal with it biblically. The way to deal with it biblically is to talk to the person individually, privately, and tell them what they have done to offend you and seek reconciliation with them. Proverbs 25 and verse 9. Well, I was going to say for whatever reason, but I know what the reason is. The reason is just weakness. Is that most times, whenever there are problems in the church, people don't do this one. They don't take it up with the person that they have the problem with. Because it's a lot easier to tell everybody else about it than it is to tell the person that you have the problem with about it. Proverbs 25 and verse 9 says, debate thy cause with thy neighbor himself, and discover not a secret to another. And this, if you can just remember one verse, dealing with interpersonal problems, not just in the church, in your marriage, in school, at work, you name it, wherever you are, this verse will really make your life better if you just follow it. And of course, I'm sure at most workplaces I've been in anyway, there's always gossip, and there's always people are talking about each other and how they don't like this guy and they don't like what he did, and spreading rumors about him and all that. This verse certainly is not practiced in most work environments. And in my current work environment, it's certainly not practiced, that's for sure. There's all kinds of talking going on there, which I don't participate in. I don't tell anybody anything about my personal life. And I don't want to hear anything about theirs unless they genuinely, just need somebody to talk to or something, but I don't want to hear about their problems with other people or whatever. Proverbs 20, all right, I read Proverbs 25:9. Go over to Matthew 18 and verse 15. So remember Proverbs 25:9, and then remember Matthew 18. Even if you can't remember the exact verse, just remember Matthew 18. And it's fairly easy to remember because we refer to, and it's just kind of interesting, but whenever we talk about dealing with a problem in the church where you take it to the brother, and if he doesn't hear you, you take it to one or two more, and then you take it before the church, we refer to that as, quote, doing Matthew 18, right? You've probably heard of that before. Oh, just do Matthew 18 with him. And even though the chapter talks about a whole bunch of things, when we say do Matthew 18, we're referring to this. And so that way, it's really easy to find in the Bible where you go to read about the instructions of that, because we actually refer to the process by the chapter of the Bible. At least a lot of us do. Matthew 18 and verse 15. Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. So see, it's between thee and him alone. Thee is singular. So if your brother has done something to offend you, to trespass against you, to sin against you, you tell him alone. You just take him off to the side and you say, brother, you have offended me. I didn't like what you said. I didn't like what you did. Whatever. You take it up with him. You don't ever want to whisper, talebear, or backbite behind your brother's back. And I've talked about all those things. I'll give you a reference to the sermon that I did on dealing with problems in the church here in a little bit. But you don't want to do any of those things. You don't talk to other people about it. You talk to the brother about it that's offended you. Now, if he will not hear you, you can either drop it or you can take one or two others with you and tell him his fault again in their presence. Verse 16. But if he will not hear thee, then take with thee one or two more, that in the mouth of two or three witnesses every word may be established. So now you take a couple of more, one or two more, and you have them there as basically as impartial witnesses. And they can hear you out, they can hear him out, and then they can decide whether you're right or he's right. And the assumption here is, in Jesus' example, is that you're right? You have been trespassed against, and then you take one or two more to talk to the brother about it, and they're going to side with you because you actually have been trespassed. But the principle would work that if maybe the brother doesn't think he trespassed against you, and maybe the other one or two you take with him says, you know what, I don't really think you should probably be taking this any further because I don't think it was a big deal. So you could go that way with it too, though Jesus' specific example here is assuming that you are in the right and you have been trespassed against. Now, if he won't hear them, that is the one or two others, you can drop it. On every stage, you can drop it. You can drop it. You can drop it. And it's probably best, under most circumstances, to drop it. Right? You don't have to take it, but if it is that important, you can take it right to the end. So if you won't hear them, you can drop it, or you can take it before the church in verse 17. It says, and if he shall neglect to hear them, that's the one or two witnesses, tell it unto the church. And if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as an heathen man and a publican. So now it comes before the church. He can hear the church and accept the church's judgment, and everything's fine. If he doesn't hear the church, if he says you guys are all out to lunch, then he's excluded. He'd be excluded for variance. He's in disagreement with the decision of the church about a matter. So he would be as an heathen man, somebody that's outside of the church. Now, I've talked about this before. I don't want to go into great detail, but this Matthew 18 would not be done if it was an excludable offense. If let's say, for instance, a guy thinks that his brother committed adultery with his wife, and he says, hey, I think you're committing adultery with my wife. He's like, no way, I'm not doing that. So you take one or two more, you say, hey, I think he's committing adultery with my wife. Here's my reasons. He's like, no way, I'm not doing that. And they're like, yeah, it sounds like you are. Nope. You take it to the church. Hey, I think he's committing adultery with my wife. And the church says, yep, it sounds like you committed adultery with his wife. And he says, yeah, actually, you're right. I'm sorry about that. You're going to be excluded whether you agree with the church or not in that case, right? So it can't be an excludable offense. This has to be like a personal offense, right? The guy ran over my chicken or something like that. And take it, you take it before the church, and the guy, he finally concedes, okay, you're right. I ran over his chicken. I wasn't paying attention where I was going. I will replace the chicken. You can still remain in the church, right? You probably shouldn't have been such an idiot and just agreed with when the first time the guy came to you instead of bringing it before the whole church about the dead chicken. But anyway, in that case, you could actually get to the last stage, agree with the church, and stay in the church, right? But it can't be an excludable offense. Now, before you take it to the final level, I want you to remember two things. I want you to remember, first of all, that mercy rejoiceth against judgment. James 2 and verse 13. In every stage, you want to ask yourself, is it worth it? Because, when you go down this road, just know that it could result in a brother being excluded from the church. And more than likely, if you get to the last stage, and even if the guy does hear the church, you guys probably aren't going to be real good friends anymore. Or it's going to take you a while to mend that fence. So you always want to remember that. Mercy rejoiceth against judgment. Is it worth it? James 2 and verse 13. For he shall have judgment without mercy that hath showed no mercy, and mercy rejoiceth against judgment. Remember, if you don't have mercy on somebody else, men aren't going to have mercy on you. God's not going to have mercy on you. Mercy rejoiceth against judgment. So just ask yourself, just take it to the extreme. Ask yourself before you take it past stage one. Stage one is fine. You talk to the guy, maybe he doesn't hear you. After you take it past there, just say, is it worth it for this brother to be excluded from the church over this? Is it worth it? If it's worth it, definitely after stage two, ask yourself that, because when it goes to the church, either he's going to hear the church or he's excluded, one of the two. Is it worth it for him to lose his place in the house of God over this issue? Chances are most issues are not worth it, right? Maybe there are some, but just be careful with that one. And secondly, remember that love covers a multitude of sins. 1 Peter 4 and verse 8. And above all these things, have fervent charity among yourselves, for charity shall cover a multitude of sins. Nothing wrong with covering a transgression against yourself, where you can just say, you know what, I'm just going to let that go. I'm just going to let it go. It wasn't right, but I'm going to let it go. I'm not going to bring it up again, and I'm going to forgive it. And we should be forgiving. We should forgive our brethren their trespasses. Colossians 3, 12 through 14. This will be the last verse I'll give you today. Colossians 3, 12 through 14. Put on therefore as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercies, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering, forbearing one another, and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. And above all these things, put on charity, which is the bond of perfectness. Now, if we just enact those verses in our lives in this church, we're going to have a great church, right? And we do have a great church, and we'll continue to have a great church if we do that. And we're not going to have a lot of problems in church. So you can see the series on dealing with problems in the church. It's at ExcelsiorSpringsChurch.com/dealingwithproblems with dashes in between. And I actually have a whole bunch of sermons on there where I've dealing with depression, dealing with adversity, dealing with trouble, dealing with fears, dealing with a whole bunch of things that I've covered over the years. Next time, Lord willing, I'm going to finish up this series. I'm going to talk about doctrinal disagreements, which I've had a little bit of experience with in the past year, and dealing with problems with your pastor, which I've had a little bit of experience with the past year. I haven't made a whole lot of friends in the last year, but anyway, I'm glad to be around friends now anyway. So, Lord willing, we will finally finish up this series next week, Lord willing.